I was 25 and I was in the middle of a master's degree. I'd been told 5 years before that I was infertile by a doctor in London, so we weren't taking additional precautions, and it was a total shock to discover that I was pregnant. I wasn't entitled to any state support, not even maternity benefit, and I did some fairly extensive looking into this. I wouldn't have got a job pregnant, I wouldn't have been able to finish my master's, I would have been pretty much unemployable and permanently broke. And I thought long and hard about keeping it, but I knew that I couldn't manage it in real life terms. It just wouldn't have worked. We just couldn't afford to do it, in real terms. I couldn't afford to go to England at the time, and I didn't want to involve anyone else in my experience. I felt that it was my experience. I got in touch with Women on Web, had a consultation with one of their doctors, and they sent out the abortifacient to an address in Northern Ireland, which we arranged to pick up from. I took the abortifacient then with my partner there, and I think I was 7 weeks pregnant at that stage, and something that I wasn't really expecting was how painful it was, and I found that quite frightening, and my partner found that terrifying. It's an extended process, so it doesn't complete for a few days, I think. It depends on the person, but it stopped being painful for me after about 6 or 7 hours. I didn't have access to prescription painkillers for a start anyway, and you can't take things like Nurofen Plus, which are the strongest across-the-counter painkiller, because they have muscle relaxants in it to stop cramping, and you need to be cramping. I didn't realise how painful it was going to be, and what I really don't like about a lot of medical information is that they say, oh, it might be uncomfortable, when it was the single most painful experience of my life, and I've broken bones. I feel there could have been a lot more honesty on that front, and I knew what was going to happen, so I felt comfortable doing it, to an extent. More support would have obviously been ideal, and this is not an ideal situation for anyone. It can be very frightening to do on your own, and if something goes wrong, it can be frightening to go to hospital because the hospital don't know that you've taken an abortifacient, because there's no difference between an induced miscarriage and a spontaneous miscarriage at that point. They can't tell. But if I had had to go to hospital, I would have been terrified, because what you've done is highly illegal in Ireland. And while no woman has been prosecuted, I think, for having an abortion, there's no saying that it's never going to happen, particularly with people like youth defence on the loose. So I think it's important for people to realise that, it's a pro-choice position, but you don't always have a choice in what you do. I didn't feel like I did. The fact that I didn't have the facility to do it in my own country is infuriating.
X is the name that's given to her because she's an anonymous 14-year-old girl who was raped and became pregnant as a result of the rape. At the time, it wasn't at all clear to what extent she was legally able to access an abortion, and certainly it wasn't clear that she was legally permitted to travel for the purposes of accessing an abortion. Her parents, who intended to bring her to the UK, contacted the Director of Public Prosecutions asking for a guarantee, or asking to make sure she wouldn't be prosecuted when she came back if they took her to and that they wouldn't if they took her to the UK for a termination. And the Attorney General, who has a number of roles, but one of his roles is said to uphold the Constitution. So he said, well, this case is raising a question about the meaning of the Constitution, so I need to actually go through legal proceedings so that we can figure out what this girl is or is not entitled to do. So the case in essence boiled down to whether or not in these circumstances she was entitled to an abortion under the Irish Constitution. The Irish Constitution has a provision in it that says it recognises the rights of the unborn, but also, and to an equal extent, the rights of the mother is the word that's used. So the question was whether or not, if the life of the mother is in risk, there is a right to have an abortion. And the second question was, does the risk of suicide constitute a risk to the life of the mother? Because the claim here was that X was so traumatised that she would in fact kill herself.
Ireland is clearly out of line with other European countries. We're the only country in the world, in fact, which has a constitutional provision which gives the woman the same right to life as that of an unborn child or fetus. So we are unique in the world and indeed unique in Europe in our laws on abortion. People have consistently voted in 92 and again in 02 to keep the X case test. We see opinion polls conducted by the Crisis Pregnancy Agency which show a majority of Irish people now believe abortion should be legalised in a broader range of circumstances even than the X case and fatal fetal abnormality.
People make the decisions about their sexual behavior based on what's best for them, right? And usually that has to do with their time, their money, their health. And that has nothing to do with ideology, really. And I think what it is there's a tightening of people that have ideas about how people need to work, and it's about other people's bodies.
There were 3 women involved in A, B and C again. These are their shortened, anonymised names. One of the women claimed that she felt she fell into the category under the Constitution where she was entitled to an abortion if she chose to have one, because she had cancer, she was undergoing treatment, she became pregnant, and essentially she was in a fix. She would either have to proceed with the pregnancy and not have treatment for her cancer, or have her cancer treatment and risk a very troublesome pregnancy as a result, so she wanted to access an abortion. That was C, and her claim was that even though the Constitution probably allowed her to have an abortion, there was no process in place whereby any doctor or hospital could tell her whether she actually fell into that category, because the government had never put anything in place after X. No government has ever put anything in place after X. So she claimed that inability to figure out whether or not you fell into the tiny exception where you can have an abortion under the Irish Constitution violated her right under the European Convention on Human Rights, and she won that case. The other 2, A and B, were not risk to the life of the mother cases. These were cases around people wanting to exercise a choice to terminate their pregnancy by means of abortion for reasons of economic necessity, sometimes for reasons of health, but not for the reason of preserving their own life. It is very clear there's no constitutional right to that. So those cases were asking whether or not there was a right to abortion under the European Convention on Human Rights, and they lost on those cases because the court said, and this is the essence for all 3 women, that it is up to the state to decide who is entitled to an abortion, if at all. But if the state does decide that someone can get an abortion, you have to have a process in place whereby you can access that right. And it's the lack of the process that violated the convention.
Basically what the European Court of Human Rights advised was that the inquiry had to happen. Not in so many words did they say that Ireland had to legislate for the Supreme Court decision, but by saying that they had to hold an inquiry and that something had to be done, it does seem as though legislation of some kind will be necessary.
We could have a referendum to have less access to abortion, if you can imagine it, it's possible. Or we could have a referendum to have more. And the A, B and C case allows for any of that. But if we leave the Constitution as it is, we must put a system in place to exercise the right that exists.
It's very frustrating to me, because one of the things I guess about abortion is that there are people, middle class people who can afford to make the trip to England, who can afford to go back and forth and then have their lives go on as they always will. But the people that this particularly disempowers are the people who have the least available cash, who might be in the most precarious situation.
It's there in a limited fashion, in the sense of, get the Ryanair flight if you have the money, if you can get it organised, if you have the contacts, if you can get off work, if you can do it without your family noticing. There's so many barriers to people accessing abortion at the moment. It puts people in incredibly difficult situations.
Doctors in Ireland have got off the hook for a long time because women have never died in Ireland through backstreet abortion. What was the big impetus to change the law in Britain in 1967? I've talked to lots of women and doctors involved in that campaign. It was because women were dying, because abortions were not safe. What we have in Ireland is a safety valve where thousands of women can travel to England, and therefore doctors here really don't have to confront the real trauma of a state where abortion is not at all available.
Really, I think legislation for abortion would impact in a very tiny way on most people's lives. I think it's likely to mean that women who want to access abortion take less risks. At present, as you might know, there is a really significant difficulty of people importing abortifacients from the internet and not always knowing what's in them. They can be really dangerous, and that's a major problem in Ireland. So in that way, I guess it would impact. What would it mean for Ireland as a country? I guess that the academic answer to that is that it would be one of the last major breaks from our immediate period of post-colonialism, where Irish identity was very much bound up with Catholicism.
In Ireland, as distinct from other countries, Ireland was controlled by the Church. The Church is an organisation of men, for the benefit of men, to the detriment of women. Full stop. And anything that gave women any kind of power, the right to plan a family, was giving them power because they weren't pregnant every 9 and 10 months. That was a threat to the establishment of the time, which was the Church and the government. Mainly Fianna Fáil, who were always behind the people. They didn't lead the people, they followed the people. And I mean, that was never meant. I wrote an article in a book in the week the Pope came to Ireland, in which I said the Catholic Church should fold its tents, fade into the night, and stop interfering in the private lives of Irish women. Now, in those days that was a terrible thing to say. Now people say good on you. It just shows that times have changed.
I think that the attitude in Ireland, in which one would rather not talk about something than deal with it head on if it might be difficult, is something that has changed, I think, in the past 20 years on a lot of things, such as, church abuse scandals, or even recently, which happened this year, which was the inquiry and the discussion and the really good political exchange on symphysiotomy for women in the 60s. Symphysiotomy was it's actually originally, I think, it dates back hundreds of years. It's not a valid medical practice anymore, but basically, if a woman has a cesarean, you can only have about, I think, maximum 3 cesareans because of the scar tissue on your stomach, and it's dangerous to have another pregnancy if you've already had 3. But what you can do, rather than give a woman a cesarean, is give her a symphysiotomy, in which you break the pelvic bones and pull out the child that way. And that obviously leads to women being unable to walk, having to relearn how to walk, lifelong incontinence, all sort of things. And that was a medical practice advocated by the Catholic Church, rather than have women, because cesareans could be seen as an indirect form of contraception, in that a woman would then have to not have any more children, whereas if you gave a woman a symphysiotomy, she would be able to have much more children. So up until very recently, there was no apology given from any politician or any official on symphysiotomy, or no inquiry sought into it as to why these women underwent this practice and why they would see a priest in a hospital before they would see a doctor. And these women have, recently they were on Vincent Brown and spoke very eloquently about their experiences, and it has been something that has been taken attention to, and it's something that a lot of people didn't know about, because these women were ashamed and embarrassed, and also for a long time didn't know that anything wrong had been done to them. And so I thought that was an interesting intersection, I suppose, between the bodily integrity of a woman and medicine, and the perhaps archaic attitude of some members of the church, in which women are viewed as broodmares that must produce children rather than anything else.
Key barrier has actually been the political establishment, historically because of their very developed links with the Catholic Church. Now you could look at that and say, well, the Catholic Church had developed links in Italy, in Spain, for example, as well. But I think in Ireland the political establishment was inherently weak, very much lean, didn't want to offend the Catholic Church, and were actually lagged consistently behind real attitudes on the ground.
Can you picture the power that men had? They were entitled to beat their wives. If you were married to me in the 60s, and I deserted you and went to Australia, you were legally held to be living in Australia. The fact that you had never left Dublin was neither here nor there. Do you know what I mean? Also, if we were married and you went off with another man, I could sue him for crim con, for taking away my property, and get damages off him. And the last case in that was in the Cork High Court, when Kerry Roach was left her husband for another fella, and he sued the fella. And the judge of a high court, and this was in the 60s, addressing the jury at the summing up of the case, said, and members of the jury, if you find in favour of the plaintiff, when assessing your damages, you could consider his wife as a prize racehorse.
I think the general attitude of pro-life / anti-choice people is fear. I think people are afraid. They don't understand how people make decisions. They're scared that their religion or their idea of choice is falling out of fashion, and I think it's condescension, right? It's the idea of knowing what's right for women to do. So there's condescending attitude, but I also think it's fearful, and I think it's easy to dismiss sometimes when feminists, or it's not easy to dismiss. Other people find it easier to dismiss feminists when they say things like you're just trying to control my body. I don't think they feel that they're trying to control someone else's body, but I think that they're trying to mitigate their own anxieties by seeing someone who's in a situation where they got pregnant from being raped. It's much, you don't want to empathize with that person because you don't want to feel like you can be raped, right? You don't want to feel like that could end up happening to you. And so I think that's a lot when you see mothers saying, I wouldn't want my daughters to, have to go through this situation. It's like, well, one of the ways to keep your daughters and your sons from getting in situations like this is to have public conversations about it.
The biggest support that's needed is you need to know that you're not being judged by your friends and your neighbours and your work colleagues, and you need to know that it's okay to say that you've had an abortion. And at the moment that doesn't exist. People do not speak about abortion in workplaces. They don't speak about it in schools unless it's to show a video that shows you that it's, you know, basically a propaganda video. It's just not acknowledged, and I think until people have that safe space to be able to discuss what they've gone through, we won't really be able to say that there's support there for women.
The Abortion Stories campaign is literally just about getting to normalise abortion and getting women to write out their stories and see that lots of other women have been through the exact same experiences, like 4,000 women every year going across, and yet no one utters a word. So the idea of the campaign is there's been an email set up, shareyouраbortionstory@gmail.com, and the idea is that not just women, men as well, can write their personal stories, and then we type them up and distribute them on the back of pub doors, on Lewis's, on buses, on darts, and just getting into circulation basically and trying to take away the stigma.
The Youth Defence Billboard campaign was a shock. It said something along the lines of, abortion tears her life apart, there's always a better way. For that to be reflected back at me while I'm walking down the street in Dublin, it's not right. I'm aware that it's legal, that they were legally able to do it, but it's not right. They used a stock image pulled of a woman looking terribly sad, and it made it appear as though this was a genuine woman who had come to share her story. Of course it was no such thing. It was blatantly deceitful, and that's one of the things that bothers me most about the pro-life movement, because over the years we've seen that they've used images that are incredibly distressing, but then when you look into it you discover that the images aren't anything like what they're saying they are.
They have so much money. Those billboards were everywhere. Like, if you weren't in Dublin at the time, there's no way to actually tell someone how many there were. They probably still are on buses, I think. There's still a few. They were on the trams, and then there were these massive billboards on lots of major streets.
They were grossly offensive, and plus they also misrepresented the situation by asserting that most women who have abortions are regretful or feel ashamed or guilty about it, whereas in fact we know from crisis pregnancy agency studies conducted here in Ireland that most women feel relieved and do not feel guilty or regretful about having had an abortion.
I think there needs to be legislation that prevents people from giving what is actually false medical information. I think the legislation as it stands with the billboard, it's a little harder because they're just saying, you know, this abortion tears her life apart. Like, it doesn't, you know, they're not saying abortion technically goes into her life and technically, you know, so it's not a factual statement, so it makes it harder to deal with. But when they are spewing false facts, which Youth Defence definitely does, and the abortion providers that prevent women, that keep women pregnant just so long as they get to the point where they can't get a legal abortion, that's got to be stopped, because it's bad healthcare and it's malpractice. It's just, it lies.
They're now focusing their rhetoric around a thing that they call post-abortive syndrome, and they claim that abortion ruins a woman's life and mental state and leaves women with years of resulting emotional damage and so on and so forth. And there's no scientific basis, and there's very conflicting scientific research on the subject of post-abortive syndrome, and figures from the Crisis Pregnancy Agency would indicate that Irish women are not experiencing this syndrome. I would sympathise extremely strongly with any woman who regretted her abortion, but I believe that those feelings of shame and regret would possibly be worse in a country like Ireland, in which these images are something that you would have to confront on a daily basis. So I think in saying that they're acting in the best interest of women while doing something like this campaign, I think that reveals in and of itself that it might not be women they really care about.
I think that one thing you are unlikely to ever get in Ireland is a calm debate on abortion. It's just an incendiary topic, and always has been in this country. I suspect that what happens is that in the interests of balance, sometimes more extreme positions get presented on one side than the other. You will never, in my experience, you will never find somebody who identifies as pro-choice standing up in a debate or going on television and saying, yes, I think we should kill all unborn babies. That will never happen. Whereas you will routinely find a person who identifies as pro-life, or I would say is anti-choice, standing up and saying that all abortion is murder. The positions are so polarised that I'm not sure calmness is really possible. What you've got to try to do is to disarm the extremities at the start and say, well, let's just try to talk about this in a limited and a calm way.
And the vandalism aspect of it is, it's what you do, basically. It was the most basic, that was all a lot of people could do, because the Advertising Standards Authority weren't listening. They weren't taking it down. So that was what your average person on the street could do, would be to rip down the poster, throw something at it, write over it. And I think it was important because that side is definitely not going to be covered by mainstream media, really. Not really.
You see, in the 70s, we had a wonderful time in the sense that the women of Ireland, the Margaret Guys, the Mary Mars, the Emma Caffertys, the Maureen de Burkes, the great feminists of the time were willing to go to prison. But the one thing that we lost out on with the Celtic Tiger, we had all plenty of money, but when you have plenty of money, you don't have time for standing up for what's right and campaigning. And I doubt, I didn't know many women during the Celtic Tiger who would have been willing to go to prison for what they believed in to be right. Whereas in the 70s, I mean, look, in the 70s, I went around and in the boot of my car, I had blank placards, just in case there was need for protest.
It's been a long road for women in this country. We have made great strides, and while I'm disappointed that we're still in this situation where a woman has to leave the country in order to be able to have an abortion should she feel that this is the route that she wants to go down, I do honestly believe that things are changing, that we have seen the causes like this go further down the road. For example, we've seen a lot of movement on gay rights, and I think that we are moving towards a more liberal agenda, and I'm glad about that because I want to live in that kind of country.
It's easy for us to speak about law in an abstraction, but law is something that happens to us all the time and happens to us as embodied entities all the time. Law is an extremely simple instrument and life is an extremely complex reality, and that translation is kind of the best that we can do.
They said Jesus came, gone through St. Louis, gone straight away. And I hear the winter will cut you gray. If tears were liquor, drunk myself sick. And I drunk myself